Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. Our guest today is Barry Zworestine. He was born and raised in southern Rhodesia, which was a British crown colony before becoming the independent Republic of Zimbabwe in 1980. But in 1976, Barry reported for compulsory military service and was sent into the Rhodesian Bush War. Following completion of his service requirement, he moved between Australia, England, and South Africa, where he became a clinical psychologist. He has lived in Australia since 2000, using his qualifications in psychology and his experience as a survivor of the Bush War to help fellow veterans cope with post-traumatic stress and lead healthy, fulfilling lives. In addition to helping veterans and other trauma survivors, Barry is an author, a runner, and he's passionate about music, and these outlets surely all inform his approach. Now, Pete, Scott, and I are all passionate about helping veterans cope with PTS, so Barry's work holds a special place. And so does Save the Brave, which is our favorite cause. You can read about them and lend your support, if you so choose, at savethebrave.org. We hope you'll consider it. And about the Break It Down show, we ask that you tell your friends about it, pass the link around, and reach back to us. John at breakitdownshow.com for me, or Pete at breakitdownshow.com for old Pedro. And we both definitely want to hear from you on this topic or whatever you have to say. And you can read more of Barry or more about Barry at barryzworestine.com. And you can and you should subscribe and get more from him. He really wants to help in any way that he can. We think the world of his work and of his dedication. Here's our guest today, Barry Zworestine.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Mohr.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Okay, hi, I'm Barry Zworestine, and I'm listening to the Break It Down show, and a real pleasure to be on it.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
It's Friday. John and I are together, and we got Barry on the show. And what's really interesting about Barry is he used to come from a place, or he comes from a place that used to be called Rhodesia. And he's Rhodesian by birth and by lineage, but that's no longer possible because there is no Rhodesia anymore. And so I thought it would be interesting to have Barry come on and describe this process, because it's not often that you get to have someone come on where the map completely changes and erases, who they are. The passport goes away, all these things are gone, and now Barry lives in Australia. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about that, and also because he's a veteran and he focuses on transition, also get into some of that stuff. So from me and John here on this Friday night, Saturday morning for you across the world, thanks for coming on the show. I'm fascinated by the Rhodesian thing. John, what are your thoughts?
Well, the transition for veterans is tough enough, but when, like you said, you have an issue of your country transitioning into something else at the same time, that's got to add complexity. But you seem to have bounced back beautifully.
Probably if you heard a bit of my story, you might realize that some of that bouncing back came at the end of a lot of running into walls.
Well, that's what makes it bouncing back. So, let us explore.
So, tell us. I guess let's just start simply. Where was Rhodesia, and then what on earth happened?
So, if you imagine a map of Africa, at the bottom is South Africa, and then if you put a little circle on the top of that, you would get what was Rhodesia, or in fact, Southern Rhodesia in the very beginning.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from the Break It Down show, checking in real quick to ask you this. John, Scott, and I all support Save the Brave with our time, our location, our effort, and our money. Each month we give a small amount. Do the same with us. Go to savethebrave.org, click on the donate tab, pick an amount that you want to come out each month, and they will handle all the rest. I stand behind these folks. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the show.
You would get what was Rhodesia, or in fact, Southern Rhodesia in the very beginning. And surrounding us, so we have South Africa at our bottom border, and we have 3 black countries on either side. So that effectively was where Southern Rhodesia was. Southern Rhodesia was a British colony. So As I was born into Southern Rhodesia, we stood up in school to God Save the Queen, and our currency was pound, shillings, and pence. Eventually, the Prime Minister, Ian Smith, and you have to forgive me, guys, I failed history and geography at school through a lack of learning and memory. So don't ask me for dates, but he eventually declared UDI, or Unilateral Declaration of Independence, and broke away from the British colony as a British colony and became Rhodesia. We were, in fact, known as the breadbasket of Africa. And in fact, there was a point at which our currency was stronger than the British pound. I mean, we were an incredibly innovative, successful people, both in agriculture, mining, industry, very self-sufficient and exporting. And as a result, a lot of countries around us rapidly cottoned onto the fact that we were a desirable country to move into. The UK didn't take kindly to the fact that we declared independence, and they instituted sanctions. So imports were severely restricted. We went through petrol rationing. I remember as a child, my dad had only so many rations to fill up the car. There was a shortage, but Rhodesians were a very innovative group of people, and I would say they still are. And what we couldn't get, we made. So we started developing our own industries where things were no longer available. And as we often say, what we couldn't make, we stole. So, in terms of the military, they were pretty innovative around there. And a lot of those innovations led the way for changes around the world. We had in the 70s, early 70s, we had landmine-proof vehicles that were, quite successful. Over time, our war was not an urban war. So our war became a border war, which is why we call it the Rhodesian Bush War. So there was an infiltration from all three borders. And what then needed to happen was that, the war began. It started really kicking up around 1975 or so. And because we were quite thin on the ground, we formed numbers of independent companies which took national servicemen like myself. And the independent companies were located in strategic points around Rhodesia. So, for example, my company was on the border of Rhodesia and Mozambique, and we had defined territories that we worked within. Outside of the independent companies, there were your units, the commandos, as you would call them, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, the RAR, which was the Rhodesian African, and then our two special units, the Selous Scouts and the SAS. Our Selous Scouts were a reconnaissance unit, and the SAS, as everybody would know, is the SAS. And they did a lot of cross-border work. Because I think we were thin on the ground, our standard operating protocol, regardless of whether you were call-ups or permanent force or special force, were four-man sticks. So when I got called up in 1976, I first tried the officer's course, which I've often said was ridiculous because I have a couple of learning disabilities, and the offshoot of that is that I have zero sense of direction. So why I decided an officer's course which would place people at risk was ridiculous. But anyway, I got to the final day of the 3-day selection, and then I was a gymnast for many years, and I had some injuries, dislocating shoulder, etc. And I came off an obstacle with my shoulder, which had dislocated, and that, thank God, was me out the officer's course. So following that, I trained as a medic. It was a 3-month, extremely intensive training, I think, from what I remember, based on the Israeli system. So after the 3 months, we were able to put drips, drugs, cut downs, deliver babies. We could work on gunshot wounds to the chest and what we call the hemopneumothorax, putting in airtight dressings. There was nothing that we couldn't do. And I was initially allocated to an area where I couldn't go because as a gymnast, I'd gone there on a school display and had an allergy to coal dust. And so I ended up in my company, which was, I guess you'd call it a very mountainous, almost quite tropical forested area. When I arrived there, they had a very different protocol for working with medics of my training. We were not based in medical rooms, but we became fully operational. So I was allocated to a 4-man stick. You'd have a stick leader, you'd have a MAG gunner, you'd have a rifleman, and then the medic. And off I went for 7 months. The setup in Rhodesia at the time was that terrorists worked in groups of, and in my areas they certainly did, in between 30 to 300. And so across Rhodesia, you'd have 4-man sticks working in areas heavily populated by terrorists. So just whether you had contacts or not, I think one of the contributing factors was certainly high states of hypervigilance. And that's why I often say there's no such thing as an unwounded veteran, because even working in prolonged states of prolonged hypervigilance has an impact on brain functioning anyway.
Yeah.
We eventually lost the war, put it crudely, I guess, political pressure. It was just impossible. And we transitioned into Rhodesia, Zimbabwe Rhodesia, under a transitional leader. I had left at that point because I left directly after the war in 1977, and I went back to university. Zimbabwe Rhodesia then became Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe, and as everybody knows, the final impact of Mugabe's regime was to turn a flourishing country that worked for blacks and whites and turned it into a dust bowl with endless human rights violations. Look, I don't think we were a perfect country. We had a white minority ruling the black majority, and there was room for change in that, but we certainly were not reducing a nation and its people to a dust bowl and a level of human rights violation that's indescribable. I emigrated. I went to South Africa for a few years and then emigrated to Australia in 1980 and arrived here on a Zimbabwe Rhodesian passport. And a few months after arriving, the government changed hands. I was requested to send in my passport, pay the money, and get a Zimbabwean passport. That never arrived, so I was actually stateless in Australia for 2 years.
Wow.
Until I got Australian citizenship. So today, as is the reality for most of us, we have no rights to the country we were born in. We really only live in cyberspace. We have an identity. And that identity, I really want to clarify, is not as white Rhodesians, it's as a Rhodesian. And, I've had the gift of meeting many white and black Rhodesians. In fact, on a recent cruise I went on in Brazil when my wife and I went shortly a few weeks ago to meet her family. On the cruise were 8 Zimbabweans, and, whether I'm a Rhodesian or they call themselves Zimbabweans, there is a brotherhood and a tribe that still connects us. So yes, if you can imagine going through Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, and then a complete dislocation and a complete catastrophe. So that's the history in a nutshell.
That is a terrible history, and one that I'm glad that you're exposing to a lot of us. I want to go back to just a brief question, and then I want to move on to the Rhodesia, Zimbabwe brotherhood that you discussed. But first, I want to ask you, you fulfilled a requirement to serve. You guys had compulsory military service in Rhodesia. I'm in favor of that practice. I think it's a great grooming ground for young men, and I think that it's a great way to solidify the brotherhood that you speak of. Is that something that you think was good for the country? And was it? It sounds like it was great for you.
Yeah, look, I think, I've often said that national service is not a bad thing. You have, let's say you had a year of national service. Now, if in a war, that's probably another discussion, but it allows, and in this age, certainly women, it puts them into a place where they learn discipline, they learn resilience, they learn the ability to cope with discomfort, they learn teamwork, they learn adaptability, adjustability, and I don't think it leaves anyone with any bad habits. So I think there's certainly, it's a rites of passage. It's definitely a rites of passage that can form very fine human beings. The Rhodesian War, I remember as a child in the 60s, as a young I was 14, 15. Every night the news would come on. And I mean this without exaggeration, 7 days a week, 4 weeks a month, week after month after year, the news would start off with security forces regret to announce the death in action of the following. And there would generally not be less than 4 names broadcast. Now you add that up day after week, month after year, and you will have some idea of the soldiers, the civilians, the farmers that were killed in action, death, or murdered in this war. Now, would I want my kids to go into that kind of a war? Probably not. Do I regret going into that war? I don't really have any regrets about anything that got thrown at me, whether it was to my advantage or whether it was a massive challenge, whether it was military-wise or life-wise. I don't have regrets. I think there was a lesson in everything. And I learned a huge amount from my experience there. I learned about the values of working as a tribe, working as a team, of being uncomfortable and becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. There were strong values I carried into my life that certainly had a huge impact on the work I do today. When I went in, I was a teacher. I worked across the world. I did a lot of moving around after the military. And I was a teacher in various fields in various countries, and then I went back to South Africa and trained as a psychologist. And I think the fact that I now am a psychologist back in a school, but as a psychologist, and with a 16-year history of working with veterans with our organization in Australia, which is called Open Arms, was really driven by my time in service and my time on operations. The fact that I spend a large part of my week sitting with extraordinary human beings, sharing stories and sharing journeys, would not have happened without the military experience. And my ability to work with the soldiers that come my way, whether they're current serving or veterans, is completely different, because when they sit down and they talk, we share a common experience. And this tribe is not related to the war. A tribe of veterans or current serving is across time, whether it's World War I, World War II, whether it's Vietnam, Afghanistan, Rhodesia. We are a tribe. There's a common denominator that joins us all together. So, I'm enriched by my time. There were things I would choose not to have had to see. And I'm certainly well aware that there are units in the Rhodesian War where their exposure to significant amounts of killing and loss were profound. And that, my generation now in their mid-60s, there are large numbers of people traumatized by what was never dealt with. If you remember, we are sort of towards the end of the Vietnam era, and there was no knowledge of PTSD. I just came out the war 2 weeks later. I was back at university. I had headaches, really bad headaches. I had a lot of body aches and pains. I was hypervigilant. I had my friends had reflected back to me many years ago that my speech, a lot of pressure of speech, a lot of talking. I was waking up 30 times a night, and I had no clue that was connected to where I just come from. So, it's a mixed bag, but I wouldn't go back and change it if I had the choice. And I think being able to have a national service where, people are taught how to work together and deal with the challenges of life is not a bad thing.
When you encounter, now that we all have retrospect, when you encounter Zimbabweans, what is it reflect on, and what do you think they think about the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe?
Well, as I said, on the cruise, there were 8 or 9 Rhodesians, or Zimbabweans as they call themselves, because it's their parents would have been in Rhodesia.
Right.
They were born into Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
And the one thing they consistently talked to me about was the impoverishment, the absolute breakdown of everything in that country, the poverty and the suffering that exists.
Wow.
That's the one thing they talk about. And it was interesting, I'm sure numbers of their parents would have been in the Rhodesian military, as we had a strong population of black soldiers in the military. And some may have even been, on the other side. But it's interesting in that at the end of the day, we come from the same country. The name is irrelevant. We are born into the same country, and there's a kinship within that. I've never, ever experienced antagonism. I've always experienced connection, and we sit and we talk. But that's what they talk about, is that our country, whether it's Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, is an absolute dust bowl in which the suffering is indescribable.
Wow.
It's unacceptable to all of us.
Yeah.
Well, now that you have 20 years of conversation with, with your military experience and your qualifications as a psychologist, I imagine that you have spoken to your fellow countrymen, as well as others who have been in all of the conflict throughout Africa.
Yeah.
What do we do about it?
That's a really good question. I think the doing for me has translated to the fact that, look, in terms of my own bunch, before I kicked off with the Veteran Services, a group of us, 5 of us, started a Facebook group for Rhodesians. And the goal there was for it to become a collection point where that if men and women, it could have been women who were exposed to having their farms attacked, women who saw really traumatic situations, men who were involved in combat carrying trauma, but there was a place for them to be supported at no cost within our group. And so I started working with Rhodesians around the world on Skype, on WhatsApp, through texting, and providing support at no cost. And that continues to this day. There are still individuals that I will be working with on WhatsApp, sending regular messages, keeping in contact, folk that will call me and we'll work through certain things they're struggling with. But outside of that, I realized that I also needed to focus on the present. And over the years of working with veterans, I became increasingly aware about the complexities of the transitioning process. And in one thing I wrote, I said that I thought the transition to civilian territory is now the next operational front. And I felt, and I still feel, that I don't think it's been mapped out effectively. And the proof for that is we know that between the military territory and civilian life, and within civilian life, veterans are getting lost. We know they're getting lost because 20 to 22 people a day or around then are still choosing no longer to live.
Hey, Barry, does that number translate internationally?
No. Oh, it's like that in America, because over the years, as I've sat down more and more with the transitioning process, and the first book I wrote, which was Your Claymore Facing, I've moved away from that to, I really feel this transitioning process needs to be mapped out more. So a person transitioning can identify where they're at. They can understand the kind of territories they're going to progress through, and can be prepared to make that progression in a more effective way. A little thing, for example, it took me a couple of years, and also self-reflection, when we have a thing called the Anzac here in Australia, where everybody marches, and Rhodesians are allowed to march as well. And when we march, us regular call-up guys, and then there are always a number of special force folk that turn up. And I always remember sitting with this good enough. And it kind of haunted me for a couple of years because, I wasn't on cross-border pursuits, and I wasn't jumping out of helicopters into fire force situations, 3, 4, 5 times a day. Until a captain said to me, it doesn't matter where you were at or the depth of it. The minute you put foot in the territory, you've earned the right to be called a veteran. But I sat with that haunting sense of not being good enough. And without fail, the majority, in my case, of men that I've sat with over time, it's always there. And it's the last thing comes out because there's a little shame around not feeling good enough. Now, that's subtle. And that shame aspect of not being good enough is not being tracked. So, we can coach people into jobs. We can teach them into counseling. But even in counseling, I don't think there's an adequate enough map of the complexity of what happens within veterans and the complexity of the territory. So, this is an area I think that I'm really focused on trying to do something and contribute so there's more of an understanding. I mean, my stuff is not just for veterans. My first book was also written because I felt that psychologists needed to know how to enter the territory of veterans and needed to know how to speak their language.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
My first book was also written because I felt that psychologists needed to know how to enter the territory of veterans and needed to know how to speak their language. So I've found a way to use operational concepts to work with guys. I go from their territory first into the process of healing. So when I sit down with guys, the first thing I'm going to say to them is, hey, why did you do a pull through on your weapon? They go, because I need to keep my barrel clean. And I go, well, if you don't keep your barrel clean, what's going to happen? And they'll say, AD, an accidental disability. I'll get a runaway gun where, it fires off with out of control,
right?
Or I'm going to get a stoppage. And then I go, right. So I go off, and what we're going to do in the first session is we're going to look at pull-throughs. And the pull-throughs we're going to look at are, what is your well-being like? Are you exercising? What's your nutrition like? What's your alcohol use like? What's your sleep like? Then I've got a number of other pull-throughs, which involve mindfulness-based work. It involves breathing. There's an approach in America called tapping, or EFT, which looks at tapping on different parts of the body that brings down the back of the brain very quickly. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm giving guys pull-throughs. So when they walk out of the room, they are already back in the driver's seat. I haven't impacted on trauma, but on the residue of their barrel that creates stress and overload and anxiety and poor sleep and alcohol use. I'm giving them tools that they can start to use immediately, but I'm grounding it in operational terminology. So I will often say to guys, listen, man, you want to get out of your ambush zone to your OP, because the OP is where you can think and plan and organize and observe. Ambush zone is when your trip flares are going and your claymores are going. I talk about which way is your claymore facing. Are you destructive within your family? Are you destructive to yourself? I teach neuroscience using these operational concepts. I talk to guys about, as you move forward, let's start to think about your arcs of fire. Let's start to talk about situational awareness. And I'd like to see psychologists and anyone working with veterans able to use the language. It's a sign of respect, and it also makes sense to veterans.
Boy, I mean, it's you're speaking directly to me. It's like you know what you're doing or something. and I guess just to give the audience an illustration, I've been working nonstop for over 3 years on my count. Like, we're working on the trauma stuff now, but first they had to get me to calm the hell down, be able to sit in a room for an hour without fidgeting and wanting to get the hell out of there, and just that significant progress to do that. It took forever, Barry, to get me to the point where I could be calm when everything didn't go right. And I didn't, there's times when I
correct.
Yeah. We were at NAM, John and I were, there's 100,000 people in a conference. And there were times where I'm like, I'm not staying in this room because I don't want to have to deal with all of but I know now that it's okay to get up and just go somewhere else, It took 3 years to get to this point. And I'm still not I still feel suicidal ideation every day.
Yeah.
When I struggle with money, it's so easy. I'm so comfortable with my own death.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. No, I understand that. But if you think about it, what you're carrying every hour, every minute of every day leaves a residue in your barrel. Now, the best example I can give is I had a bloke, a special force guy, come into my room. And I walked in, I looked at his eyes and I went, geez, man, you got 1,000-yard look there. And he sat down and he was emanating just stress and overwhelm.
Right.
And I said to him, out of 10, your suds, out of 10, where are you, mate? And he said, I'm 100 out of 10. Okay, I'm going to show you some really weird stuff, but I just want you to copy me. Is that all right? So I took him through a 7-minute sequence, literally a 7-minute sequence of body and brain-based strategies and tools. We sat down at the end of that, and I said to him, "How are you doing?" And he said to me, "I actually don't believe what's happening. It feels like I'm absolutely grounded in my body." Now, that's 7 minutes, and if you think about it, when somebody, as you know, when you completely upregulated, having a conversation with you is not going to work, right? You just want to get the hell out of the situation.
Yes.
But a lot of psychology starts off on the conversation. Let's talk about what's happening. Tell me about your worst experience. How are you feeling? What are your thoughts? But when you are kicking up, when your ambush zone is right out of sight, the front of your brain, which is where you have a conversation. So why are we having conversations and trying to get people to heal initially when they're so freaked out that they cannot listen or cognitize? So what I say is there's a real place for the top down, which is the conversations, the mapping, the dysfunctional thoughts, the catastrophizing thoughts, but we also need bottom up. Get people back in their bodies. So they're OP, they're no longer in the ambush zone, they're in the OP, and then they're ready to have a conversation. But without those body and brain-based tools, you're going to spend 3 years, 4 years, 5 years just trying to ground yourself in your body.
Wow. I think, Barry, that, the things that you say about the respectful conversations and the vocabulary with veterans is absolutely true, but you are speaking to universal truths of folks who have suffered profound trauma,
of course,
regardless of where that is. And I think that I'd like to talk about the universality of it, because your unique position is that you have touched on folks who have been visited by trauma.
Yes.
And mostly veterans, but all around the world. And a lot of people who are experts in the field have a particular area of study that's, that's central to a geography. What can you say about the universality of it all? Is there any difference from one location to another that you've witnessed?
Look, outside of my work in my school, I made a choice a long time ago that a calling to work with the tribe that I come from, military. And I've never wavered from that. So, when I began in the early days, I was working on a small practice, but I made a commitment that I was not going to move beyond that. And so for 16 years, I've only stayed with referrals from our organization and the people that I've worked with at no cost around the world. But within those referrals, there have been partners and children of veterans. Now, trauma is an overwhelming experience that has an impact on the brain, but it also lives within the body. And, one of your top guys in the States is a guy called Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And he's spot on. I mean, he changed how I worked in that he says whatever's in the brain is in the body, and we're able to access the experience in the body. If all we are doing is playing around in the OP and we're ignoring the deeper stuff that lies in our body, we're running around in circles to a large extent. And so, my background in my master's degree was the sort of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic conversations around where you come from and the impact it has. And it's beautiful in that it's a very human-based, compassionate way of sitting with people. But I rapidly realized that guys were sitting in my room and they were healing because, I have a great love of the people that see me, but that wasn't enough. There was stuff in the corners of the ambush zones that I wasn't getting to. And so for 16 years, I have constantly tried to stretch into ways to be able to be more respectful, but also to be able to help people to heal what I call claymores that sit in the corners. Now, it doesn't matter whether those claymores come from war, whether they come from sexual abuse, whether they come from workplace bullying, whether they come from catastrophic accidents. They are claymores that sit in corners, deep, dark corners of our room, and we understandably don't want to go there. But I've been driven by trying to find a way to support people to get there without stressing them out or freaking them out or leading the way. There are modalities, and perhaps if there's time we can talk about it. It's a thing called brain spotting. And brain spotting uses the eye position. So, for example, a veteran will come into my room and I'll ask him, what is it that you want to work with? I'm not going to tell him, we're going to need to go to your worst experience. I'm going to ask him at what point in the territory he wants to start. He may choose to start on the periphery of his territory and move slowly into his ambush zone. It's fine. He leads the way. Then I will say to him, I'll say to him something like, look, I noticed when you were talking about a loss of your mate that you were looking in the corner of a room. Do you know that spot? And he goes, yeah, I was looking at that leg, at the bottom of the leg. And then I'll explain to him, that the neuroscience has indicated that where the brain goes, the eye goes, and where the eye goes, the brain goes. So what I say is the line of fire between the brain, the memory, and the eye position is a line of connection between the OP and the ambush zone. There's a connection. It allows access to memory, but it also opens the brain to the deeper stuff in the brainstem. So what I'll be saying to guys is, hey, listen, I want you to hold that position. You don't have to look at me, but let's become curious observers to what the brain is going to bring up. What's going to come up? We become curious. He doesn't have to drive it. I don't have to drive it. We create what I'd call, in many ways, a mindfulness-based situation in our room. And we use a combination of neuroscience and the mindfulness position, and we allow the brain to reveal itself. I'm following. We're both following what the body brings up and what the brain brings up. There are approaches like EMDR. There are a lot of body-based approaches now which help people to get to where they want to go to without telling them what to do, telling them where they go, and telling them what they have to experience. So, that's just my personal mission.
Terrific. It's great to hear the passion with which you speak about it and the depth to which you are studying all of these folks and working with traumas. And I'd like to know, when you are working with someone, is there a particular, you allow them to dictate direction, but is there a particular path that you try to steer them towards that ends in recovery?
Yeah, look, the first thing for me, and we know it's critical, is the relationship. So the first thing is I have to build trust between myself and the person I'm sitting with. It's a lot easier to some extent. So, for example, I had an ex-Special Force guy a long time ago sit opposite me. And my veteran organization will often let guys, they're referring to me, they'll say, look, this guy is a combat veteran, and we think that connection, that experience will help you both. So they often know about my background. This guy was a sniper, and he said to me, something I've never told anyone. He said, I've never told somebody because I really worry about what their eyes are going to do when I share that with them. And I said, okay, mate, so, I've not been where you are, but I've been in the territory. What is it that you'd like to tell me? And he said, I really miss hunting people. And all I said to him was, I understand.
Wow.
And he was watching. He was watching me at that point. He was watching to see whether my eyes grew wider, whether my body stiffened. He was absolutely attuned to what was going on. And he would have picked up the faintest flicker.
Yep.
I said, I understand. And at that point, we had the relationship. Now, without the relationship, you can use any modality you want. Doesn't matter. But a tool without connection is severely impeded. So the first is the relationship. I work a lot with the fact that, it is uncomfortable when we get close to the challenging parts of ourselves, whether it's been through military operations or other levels of trauma-based stuff out of the military. And I go, imagine journeying through a long tunnel. It's uncomfortable. The darkness may be encountering, but if you just trust and keep your foot on the accelerator slowly at your own pace, there is a beginning and there is an ending. So we can slowly move through that tunnel at a speed which is comfortable for you, and we will only progress as you feel you are able to. So I'm not upregulating any fear that I'm going to throw you into something and you just have to trust me and sweat it out. Now, I'm not saying that those approaches don't work. I'm driven by a value that believes that people I sit with can heal, but they can heal in a way determined by what their bodies and their brains and our relationship and my encouragement and trust in the situation can naturally heal. It's just it's my way up the mountain. It's my way up the mountain. So relationship on its own is not enough. It's very easy to collaborate with avoidance. We have a great relationship and we talk and nothing happens. But it's about, we're on a patrol, we're going to go through some challenging territory together, but I'm by your side and you will walk ahead of me and I will either be beside you or slightly behind you, but I will never be ahead of you pulling you. So I think it's a mixture of all of that is necessary within the healing situation.
Your way up the mountain sounds remarkable.
Yeah.
I like my way up. I sleep well with it. And my goal is to do no harm.
Yeah, that's a big thing. And this is more for the audience because I'm sure you know about this, but like at my VA, it's a teaching hospital. So my therapist often rotates out to somebody else. And then at my smaller VA clinic, now I don't go to this one anymore, but they were always impacted by budget constraints. So my therapist would always change.
Yeah.
And I would have a group that would be bound by that one therapist. And so here I am trying to get through some pretty heavy stuff, trying to build trust. And sometimes, you know this, Barry, sometimes you just don't jive with the person for whatever reason. And it's the smallest things. That relationship is so much more important because I'm trusting you to take some of my heaviest stuff that I'm not even sure I know that's there until I start getting comfortable enough to go looking for it.
Yeah. And this is a reality, unfortunately, within a large number of organizations. I'm very fortunate in that my organization are so compassionately driven and so attuned to veterans. I mean, Open Arms is an extraordinary organization. I have seen their generosity. I have seen their ability to allow us to work creatively with people in responsible and professional ways, willingness to adapt and change as more knowledge comes up over time. But in many organizations, even in this country, people don't. They have their 10 sessions, or as you say, you have your rapidly rotating people. But, that's like going on a patrol, and then halfway along your patrol, a hand comes down, grabs a couple of members, pulls them out, throws in a stranger. I understand the reality, but it certainly doesn't make things easy.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't. But I suppose there's a constriction on the finances. And, I acknowledge all of that, but I push quite aggressively the fact that all of us as professionals working with veterans can learn to communicate in a way that embodies, respects, and brings their territory and knowledge into the healing and the therapeutic process. I don't accept anything less than that. I'm a bit tight on this, in that if you want to work with veterans, do not think that you've got a MA in clinical psychology or a PhD is enough. It's not. That just gets you to the door. If you want that veteran to open the door to you, and to tell the truth, he needs to open the door to you, not the other way around.
Yeah.
You need to demonstrate an understanding of who he is, an understanding of his territory and what it's like, and the language that he uses. That is not simple. That is not complex. You do not have to be at war to use the language I've been using today. You just have to learn it and understand it.
Well, in the language that you use, the word respect keeps coming up over and over again.
Always.
Yeah.
What is the core value in the military? Tribe respect, dependability and reliability. So what is it when we don't show respect? We're unreliable. People are shifting all the time. We leading the way. Patrol is only as effective as how everybody works together. Yeah, you've got a bloke on point, you've got a tracker. but it's people working together. So why should we not be replicating the values in the military in our therapeutic or our professional or our healing environments? Because that's what they want and that's what they're used to. And I often say, my big thing is that as veterans, we never leave a man behind, yet we so quickly leave our own warrior behind and abandon him as we try to transition into civilian life. I say to guys, your warrior is still there. Your self-discipline, your ability to cope with discomfort, your wonderful values of reliability and trust and dependability. You're an extraordinary human being. Parts of your warrior, bring him in and let him combine with a civilian. Because frankly, from where I stand in civilian life, we are seriously shortchanged in the values that veterans have. And I do believe that the combination of the military and the veteran makes a far better human being. I'm not saying this, there are civilians that have the most incredible values, but overall, we are very shortchanged in how people work and think in this age.
I'm letting that thing hang for a second. That's some powerful, powerful comments. The whole thought about, a master's degree or a PhD, that just gets you in the door. Again, let me illustrate what that feels like on my end. How many, every time they change something, or every time you get put in a new clinic, they do an intake and they want to know about the worst moments of your life on a fucking piece of paper. And you're supposed to write this shit out.
Don't get me started on that one.
I am going to get you started, because these are the things that we deal with. And I'd just hand it back an empty piece of paper, and I'm like, I'm not filling that out because I'm not going to have a shitty day the rest of the day,
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not one thing. I mean, you're out on a 4-man stick. Who knows if or when you get ambushed? How many times do you have to go through that? How many times do you have to have something negative happen, or the perception, the belief that something negative is about to happen all the time? I can't, there aren't enough papers to write all that stuff down.
And look, I know that there is a strong evidence base that this works, but I think, it's like when we go to war, we don't take one weapon. We have an array of weapons. We have HE grenades, phos grenades, smoke grenades. We have a whole array of things. And what we take is determined by the territory. So every person trying to support veterans needs to really spend a lot of time reflecting on what is needed in this territory. Now, for some, exposure therapy really does work. It also depends on our own personalities. I try to find a way of walking up the mountain towards healing using a way, as I've described, that doesn't necessarily need to throw people into the ambush zone or write down the worst experience. If you want to use that, that's fine. I do not judge it. As long as we do no harm, and at the end of it, somebody is back in their bodies and back in their hearts. That's fine. But I just choose... My goal is through the relationship and becoming better at the tools I use. We go on a journey together up a mountain, and it's a patrol in which we are both engaged at a level of trust, and the tools I use change. Some folk look at this tapping business and they go, Barry, I am not doing tapping. I go, that's cool. We're not going to do it. I go, so here's some other tools. What are you comfortable? Where are you comfortable? They'll go, okay, you know what? I love the breathing tools, and I'm happy to do this mindfulness-based program and look at my exercise and eating, but I don't want to do the rest. And I go, that's fine. So they are fully involved in the tools, the weapons, the strategies they choose as we move forward together.
I mean, that's exactly what I need, in my path to get through these things. Yeah. Which, by the way, all of this stuff you're talking about, now you have to overlay that to, getting and keeping a job. It can be really tough.
But also, if you think about it, let's say somebody's got trauma. Mm-hmm. But trauma is in the center of your ambush zone. So go out a couple of Ks from that ambush zone. You may find grief, loss of mates, not even if mates got killed. That I'm so much grief at the moment because I don't know where I belong. I've lost my mates. My organization a lot of the military organizations, if you are disabled in any way, you're out. Your family spits you out, and that's become increasingly more popular. So now there's loss of tribe, there's a moral injury, and that this was the place I gave my life and my blood, and I was rapidly shunted out. There's that sense of not good enough. So many things we can begin to work at before we actually progress into the ambush zone, the core. Even things like, what's your sleep like, mate? Let's try and impact on a little bit of exercise. Go and walk to the post. Go and collect your post. Go for a walk around the block. You've cranked on a lot of weight. You're drinking a lot. What you prepared to do there? Let's look at that. We're not even getting into the ambush zones at that point. If I take you into a room and the first thing I go is, I want you to write down your worst experience. I've built no trust. I've built no relationship. And that stuff is somewhere there in a room. But there's grief and all the things we've talked about. Let's start off step by step from a point at which they are comfortable and willing to engage and slowly move forward into the ambush zone. I prefer that way.
Wow. Well, the warriors you describe are the folks that we have trained and leaned into to deliver respect and reliability, and our failure in humanity to deliver respect and reliability to them in transition back to civilian life is horrendous. And we appreciate your work and your commitment to this work. And for our audience, go to barryzworestine.com to read more about Barry, subscribe, buy his books, and read more. And barryzworestine.com, just like it sounds, and you'll also see that in the show notes, listeners. And we encourage you to go there and to look around and to get familiar with Barry and his work. We're huge admirers of you, Barry, and we thank you for your service and your commitment and your appearance here on the show.
Yeah, look, thanks, mate. But also just to add that, the Which Way Is Your Claymore is a little book. It can fit in your back pocket, and it's at the lowest price. But I also want to say that on my website, there's the second one, which is just a PDF, which is Which Way Is Your Warrior Facing. That's free. It's a PDF they can download, and it's got everything in it, and it's no cost.
And so, I would encourage you guys to also go to LinkedIn and connect with Barry. He's definitely available for chatting and whatnot. I mean, he's out there doing this primarily as service because he's got a regular job. Yeah. So thank you for doing that as well, Barry.
As I said, I'm really fortunate. I am involved with an extraordinary veteran organization. I have a job in a school, and so income is not my issue. So it's the very act of service, I think, for me, which is, I often say that I may have impacted on people's lives, but every person I've sat with over 16 years has made me a better person, a father, a husband, and a professional. I've changed as much as I may have impacted on their lives. And I'm grateful that I can carry on doing what I'm doing, and that a large part of it is simply service. That's it.
That's a lesson for all of us.
We need service. Yeah. It's who we are, and we should be encouraged to look at what aspects of our life, as far as we can be of service.
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, thanks, mates. I really appreciate the opportunity to sit with you both and share some conversation.